Everyone underestimates me, but then they turn their back and I'm like, boo!
I think The Shining is perhaps the most theorized movie in cinema history. The Shining is one of the only films where within the first 10 minutes basically give the entire narrative away before the movie even starts.
From almost the start of the film, we get our first clue as to what The Shining is really about.
I think strongly suggests that that book is definitely the trigger that many researchers and theorists have proposed it to be.
Are they setting up Jack in The Shining to be a mind-controlled assassin?
And clearly this is Stanley Kubrick telling Stephen King, this is my story, not yours.
Stanley Kubrick had intelligence ties in a very big way.
Several top-ranking NASA officials even visited the set several times. And
for him to create a movie that is not depicting ghosts or apparitions, but people acting as ghosts, as an experiment ran at the Overlook.
And there are common factors which link the two, not least MK Ultra.
Kubrick was forced to take The Shining by Warner Brothers.
Keep in mind that Jack and Danny are the only ones to enter into room 237.
That when you see things here in the hotel, just think of them as pictures in a book.
The first time that Danny encounters anything strange is in the games room when he sees the twins.
MK Ultra mind control is so absolute. Anyone can be programmed to do anything.
Jack is writing his own view of psychic driving. Most people don't know that Stanley Kubrick shot an ending to The Shining that almost no one ever saw.
This ending reveals the entire plot of the movie.
You think that we're watching a horror movie where ghosts are kind of forcing a man to go off and kill his family, but what are we really watching here?
We are not professing to tell you the complete story of these activities. We are professing to tell you the complete story that we know.
Right.
But these records that we've uncovered don't tell the story. They tell pieces of it.
So 10 years before Stanley Kubrick made The Shining, he made another film. It was a film about mind control. It was called A Clockwork Orange. And in that movie, the protagonist is taken by the government, fed drugs, and then they show him movies which control his mind.
What we are contending is that in his career, Stanley Kubrick made another film about mind control, but it's coded and buried deep within something that you wouldn't expect. There are many theories as to what The Shining is really about, from the faking of the moon landing to Native American genocide and the Holocaust. While those topics are very important, we believe that there's something even more sinister lurking beneath the surface of this masterful film.
Here's Johnny!
The Shining is like 4D chess. It has many layers and many different meanings.
Whether you are a film savant or a casual viewer, you know the name Stanley Kubrick. He will go down in history as one of the greatest filmmakers to ever have lived. He is a master of the art and a perfectionist at every level. And he has left behind a plethora of films that can be interpreted in many different ways.
I think The Shining is perhaps the most theorized movie in cinema history, and there's many really good interpretations of The Shining. You can see them in that movie Room 237, but I think the interpretation that we're going to present here is probably the most intriguing.
Many others have studied The Shining film for many years and have already pointed out things that just don't add up.
There are several continuity errors in the movie which are really kind of unexplainable. And it's kind of curious because Kubrick was known as a man who paid attention to detail. So why are there these gigantic continuity errors in this movie? They spent over a year shooting, so he had plenty of time to make sure everything was right.
For instance, the sticker disappearing on Danny's door, the chair disappearing behind Jack, the carpet changing when Danny stands up in the hallway, and that end scene, the very end of the movie, when Kubrick fades the shot of the picture on the wall, just for a split second, you can see a tiny Hitler mustache beginning to form on Jack's face, which is very interesting because the date on the picture says July 4th, 1921. Adolf Hitler rose to power within the National Socialist German Party, commonly referred to as the Nazi Party, in July of 1921.
Please lend some money. I wouldn't think of it. Well, how can I repay you? It's okay, really.
There are TVs in The Shining that are going, but they're not plugged into anything. There's Beatles Abbey Road symbolism in the movie, and we can't forget that the manager of the hotel, Ullman, looks a hell of a lot like JFK.
And this site was chosen for its seclusion and scenic beauty.
Designed it to be a movie that would take you a long time to really unlock what was going on.
The Shining is one movie that has really been put through the ringer, and one thing that people really don't notice, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, which is when Halloran calls the police station from Florida, the police act as if they didn't even know anyone was up at the hotel, which is really strange because Wendy had already called the police before, earlier in the movie.
This is KDK-12 calling KDK-1.
This is KDK-1. We're receiving you. Over.
There's a lot of sexual innuendo in The Shining, both sexual tension between Danny and Jack, but Kubrick also throws in little things that really make you wonder. For instance, when Jack first meets Ullman, the hotel manager, and they shake hands.
Come in, Jack. Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Mr. Ullman.
The paper tray on the desk gives Ullman a hard-on at that exact moment.
This is my secretary, Susie.
Hello.
Susie, how do you do?
So Wendy and Danny are watching TV, and in the background, in the corner, there's a fire truck and a teddy bear, and the fire truck has a ladder sticking up, and it is giving the appearance that the teddy bear has a hard-on. It does make you wonder if they were done on purpose for unknown reason.
Anything you say, Lloyd. Anything you say.
Or when Jack is in the gold room and stands up and Grady spills the alcohol on Jack, there's a lady that walks past that has a bloody handprint on her ass. There's so much to this film that keeps people coming back again and again, and it has really cemented it into its own legacy all on its own.
The Shining is Kubrick's 11th film, and there's 11s all through the film. There's the Apollo 11 shirt, the lights on the walls look like 11s. 11 is a special number in occult theology. In my films, Kubrick Odyssey 1 and 2, but in particular Kubrick's Odyssey 1, I posit that The Shining is actually Stanley Kubrick's confession to doing the moon landings. And I give pretty good evidence for that. Now, if he did fake the Apollo moon landing, then he probably has really deep connections into the intelligence world.
Stanley Kubrick had intelligence ties in a very big way. The CIA's MK-Ultra programs were admitted to the public in 1975, 5 years before the release of The Shining. In the beginning of Kubrick trying to figure out what movie he wanted to do next after Barry Lyndon.
So in 1973, Warner Brothers had the rights to the book The Exorcist, which was a huge best-selling book. And they just signed a contract with Kubrick, and they offered him to do the movie. Kubrick declined.
I cast you out! Unclean spirit!
Shove it up your ass!
In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ!
Because Kubrick wanted to make Barry Lyndon. Well, he made Barry Lyndon, but Barry Lyndon lost more money than any Kubrick film ever.
Sir Richard, this pistol must be faulty.
Warner Brothers had a pre-published copy of The Shining, and they sent it to Stanley. And it's very likely that they kind of said, Stanley, we lost a lot of money on your last movie. We'd like you to do The Shining. And the reasoning behind this is that they'd had super success with an A-list director and a horror novel in The Exorcist, which was directed eventually by William Friedkin, was one of the biggest hits of all time. And they thought that they could repeat this by hiring an A-list director to do the best-selling book, The Shining.
I'm sure she'll be absolutely fascinated when I tell her about it. She's a confirmed ghost story and horror film addict.
Stanley Kubrick has openly criticized Stephen King's writing ability. There's a shot on the set of The Shining where there's a definitely no smoking sign, and the SMO of the sign has been blacked out, and the sign appears to read, definitely no King.
There are many differences between Kubrick's film and Stephen King's novel. Things are added, things are subtracted. In the Stephen King novel, Jack drives a red Volkswagen Beetle. In the movie, Kubrick, for some unknown reason, changed it to a yellow Beetle. And that's curious, because later in the movie, when Halloran is driving to the Overlook during a snowstorm in Denver, he sees a horrific car accident in which a semi-truck has crushed a red Volkswagen Beetle. And clearly this is Stanley Kubrick telling Stephen King, this is my story, not yours.
It's been said that Kubrick was an atheist and that he didn't believe in the paranormal or the supernatural, which might have been influence for him to create a movie that is not depicting ghosts or apparitions, but people acting as ghosts, as an experiment ran at the Overlook, and as a part of an experiment within the film, and also an experiment on the audience.
It may be that Kubrick was forced to take The Shining by Warner Brothers, and he probably thought that the story was coming up short. And that's when he decided to start adding all these other layers into the movie so that people would watch this movie over and over and get different interpretations almost every time they saw it.
The Shining has been regarded as one of the greatest horror films ever made. But is it really a horror film?
I would not really call it a horror film because so many things have been left open to interpretation. Yeah, King hated Kubrick's The Shining so much that he actually remade it. One of the only films that Kubrick made that got remade. And it wasn't very good. We kind of found out why Kubrick thought the story had a lot of shortcomings. And I think eventually Warner Brothers gave him a large check to just shut up.
Oh, no, I don't see that. No. Absolutely not.
The Shining is one of the only films where within the first 10 minutes basically give the entire narrative away before the movie even starts.
Physically, it's not a very demanding job. The only thing that can get a bit trying up here during the winter is the tremendous sense of isolation. Because for some people, solitude and isolation can, of itself, become a problem. Not for me. Well, my predecessor in this job hired a man named Charles Grady as the winter caretaker. And he came up here with his wife and two little girls, I think about 8 and 10. And he had a good employment record, good references. And from what I've been told, I mean, he seemed like a completely normal individual. But at some point during the winter, he must have suffered some kind of a complete mental breakdown. He ran amok and killed his family with an axe. Then he put both barrels of a shotgun in his mouth. Police, they thought that it was what the old-timers used to call cabin fever.
The Shining is very unique in the way that nothing supernatural or paranormal really happens in the entire film, with the exception of the ball rolling toward Danny before he goes into room 237, where he is assaulted by a woman, which is a scene that happens off camera. And then when Jack goes into room 237 to try and figure out what happened to Danny, he then sees a very attractive woman turn into an elderly lady, which he later refutes and says that nothing happened in room 237.
Did you find anything?
No, nothing at all. I didn't see one goddamn thing.
Keep in mind that Jack and Danny are the only ones to enter into room 237 and thus far are the only ones to experience anything strange. And both are not telling Wendy what has happened.
What makes The Shining so interesting is its ambiguity. Unlike other horror films, which have a beginning and a middle and an end, and everything is all wrapped up nice at the end, that doesn't happen in The Shining. You actually, on the first viewing, have very little idea of actually what's going on in this movie.
The first time that we meet Wendy and Danny in The Shining, they're both wearing red, white, and blue. And Wendy is reading a book by an intelligence officer named J.D. Salinger called Catcher in the Rye.
Well, a substitute teacher out on Long Island was dropped from his job for fighting with a student. A few weeks later, he returned to the classroom, shot the student unsuccessfully, held the class hostage, and then shot himself successfully. This fact caught my eye. Last sentence, Times. A neighbor described the teacher as a nice boy, always reading Catcher in the Rye. This nitwit Chapman, who shot John Lennon, said he did it because he wanted to draw the attention of the world to Catcher in the Rye. And the reading of this book would be his defense. Young Hinckley, the whiz kid who shot Reagan and his press secretary, said, if you want my defense, all you have to do is read Catcher in the Rye.
My name's Mark Devlin. I'm a former club and radio DJ turned author, researcher, broadcaster and public speaker. And these days I look into the true nature of the music industry and entertainment and popular culture generally and what it's really used for. And unfortunately, it's not all about fun and entertainment. There are other agendas at play.
Only conditioned American who's been trained to kill and then to have no memory of having killed. His brain has not only been washed, as they say, it has been dry cleaned.
Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger is a book which has been identified as a trigger in MK Ultra style mind control programming. So Mark Chapman was found reading a copy of this book on the scene of the John Lennon murder. Then, only a few weeks later, John Hinckley Jr., who's the guy who attempted to assassinate Ronald Reagan, was also found with a copy of Catcher in the Rye. And Hinckley ticks all the boxes for having been a programmed assassin in the same way as Chapman, and The Catcher in the Rye just keeps cropping up as one of these books which seems to have been used in programming of this nature.
Both the Mark David Chapman and John Hinckley assassinations came within a year of the release of The Shining. Are they setting up Jack in The Shining to be a mind-controlled assassin?
Little pigs, let me come in.
So it makes sense if he's making a multi-layered movie that one of those story layers is going to be about his experiences with the intelligence world, including MKUltra.
Hallucinogenic drugs, hypnosis, electric shocks to the brain, some of the methods used in secret CIA mind control experiments.
I'm Walter Bosley. I spent 20 years in the United States national security community between multiple agencies, including the FBI and the Air Force OSI. I'm a commissioned officer in the U.S. Air Force Reserve, inactive, and my entire time on active duty, I was a special agent of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, the OSI. MKUltra is a technology of methods to control personnel, specifically operatives. That's what it was developed for. Originally, it was developed so that captured air crews during the Cold War could resist interrogation. From there, what was pursued was using MKUltra methods, psychiatrically control assassins. Literally assassins in the way that it would be perfect for operational security. You would have a trained assassin. He would have his assassin side of his psyche suppressed until they needed him or her. And with a code word, much like the film The Manchurian Candidate.
Sergeant Raymond Shaw.
Yes?
Raymond Prentice Shaw.
Yes.
They could activate this operative, they would go do their mission, and then afterwards they would deactivate them with another code word or phrase, and that person would go about their business having no idea that they had committed an execution, an assassination.
You think that we're watching a horror movie where ghosts are kind of forcing a man to go off and kill his family, but what are we really watching here?
Laurel Canyon is in the Hollywood Hills overlooking Los Angeles. I paid a visit there in 2017 on the track of many of these places that were mentioned by Dave McGowan in his book. So I went up there with a podcast host named Greg Carlwood to the former house of Frank Zappa, former house of Jim Morrison. We got as far up as we could to Lookout Mountain. When you get up there in the hills, you get a great vista over the city of Los Angeles. And there are several canyons up there, and Laurel Canyon sits sort of amidst all of those. Well, in the mid to late 1960s, you had so many of the musicians who would come to populate the so-called counterculture scene, which was the hippie flower power culture of the time, and why it was that bands and musicians from all over the United States were getting drawn magnet-like to Laurel Canyon. The interesting thing about it is that that neighborhood had no musical heritage whatsoever up to that point. So there were no recording studios, no music clubs, no record labels based there, but for some reason, all these musicians were congregating there. And they all went on to become the most prominent, influential bands and groups in that counterculture scene. So they were changing cultural attitudes among young people, largely through music. Also through things like drugs and other societal changes that were happening, but mainly through music. And all of this was happening in this one obscure neighborhood.
We want the world and we want it now.
Almost without exception, the fathers of these important musicians had direct connections into the world of the military. It might be the Army, the Navy, the Marines, it might be the Pentagon, the Defense Department, different aspects of government, different expressions of the establishment in terms of bloodline aristocratic families, secret societies like the Freemasons, Bohemian Grove, the Century Club, Harvard and Yale universities, Ivy League universities, and these were all pretty unlikely professions for the fathers of rock stars to have. You would never find any working class professions. So there were no dockers, labourers, no lorry drivers, no plumbers, no electricians, but plenty of generals, admirals, politicians. A regular mainstream mind might chalk that up as just one of those things, just coincidence. But when you've been in this business as long as I have, and you've researched as much stuff as I have, you realise that there's no such thing as coincidences like that.
Jack Nicholson was also one of the early people involved in the Laurel Canyon movie scene. Not just a music scene was going there, but a movie scene was also going there. And Jack wrote and starred in a movie called The Trip, which glorified LSD. And he also was the star of the most famous Laurel Canyon movie, Easy Rider, starring Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper.
What you represent to them is freedom. What the hell's wrong with freedom, then? That's what it's all about.
It was that movie, Easy Rider, which inspired Kubrick to hire Jack Nicholson for The Shining. But he also starred in Psych Out.
Let's kill her and eat her.
What are you laughing at?
Wrote and starred in the Monkees movie Head. The Monkees were another famous Laurel Canyon band.
The Monkees. Mickey, Davy, Mike, Peter in Head. That's right, Head.
The strange thing is that we don't know who Jack Nicholson's father is, and supposedly he doesn't know either. He was born out of wedlock, and his father disappeared soon after he was born.
But there's another actor that Kubrick worked with who was a famous resident of Laurel Canyon, and that would be the star of Lolita, Sue Lyon.
Broadway at dusk. And as the lights go on, the News of the Day camera records the welcome for Lolita, the film the whole town's talking about. Introducing Sue Lyon in the title role and starring James Mason, Shelley Winters, and Peter Sellers.
In the 1950s and early 60s, Kubrick had established a partnership with James Harris, who would be his producer, leaving Kubrick to just be able to write and direct. And so they made 3 movies together. They made The Killing, Paths of Glory, and Lolita. Sue Lyons was also best friends with Michelle Phillips, one of the singers in the famous Laurel Canyon group Mamas and the Papas. It was in Lolita that Michelle Phillips says that her best friend, Sue Lyons, lost her virginity at the age of 14 to producer James Harris, who was 32 at the time.
Lyon, how old were you when you were picked for this picture, Mr. Kubrick?
I was 14.
Sue went on to lead a tragic life, and she blamed much of her troubles on the experiences she had behind the scenes of Lolita.
Gossip columnist Dorothy Kilgallen even commented on the relationship in one of her columns. Michelle Phillips and Sue Lyons had had a friendship since they were very young, since they both lived in Laurel Canyon.
You're a disgusting, despicable, loathsome criminal fraud!
Do that.
Because you cheated me. Because you took her at an age when young lads...
That's enough.
Say, what you take it away for, mister?
George Stephen Morrison is probably the best example we have of one of these prominent musicians coming out of Laurel Canyon having high-ranking connections into the military. So he was a Navy admiral, and he was in charge of the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin false flag event. which was used to justify the escalation of America in the Vietnam War and the very bloody, murderous body count that it left in its wake. He also happens to be the biological father of Jim Morrison of The Doors. So you've got this iconic rock god who was effectively a poster child for this anti-war generation, the baby boomers of the time. They were the targets of this psychological operation, which was all about sex and drugs and rock and roll, hitting them with all of that. LSD in unending quantities, which was the drug of choice attached to that whole scene. The supply lines for the LSD lead directly back to the CIA. There's documentary evidence to prove that this was the case. And then you've got this guy who was effectively representing the youthful angst of that generation, and his dad basically started the Vietnam War, or at least escalated it to a major degree. Again, many people will probably say maybe Jim was not happy with his father's value system and he sought to disavow himself of it by going a different path. And if that were an isolated example and the only one we need to deal with, we might be able to draw that conclusion. But it's not. That's one of so many examples. The fathers are always admirals, generals, colonels, captains in these different military institutions. So we have to conclude from this, faced with the evidence, that Jim Morrison was an actor playing a role. And when he was out on stage as the frontman of The Doors, shirtless, exposing himself on stage, doing drugs, performing drunk, it was all an act.
I think these days, especially in the States, you have to be a politician or an assassin or something to really be a superstar.
A couple of years before that, we can find an ad of a young, clean-cut, scholarly-looking Jim Morrison doing a commercial for the University of Florida.
But what happened? How come my parents or the state or the university didn't look ahead?
And then he got the gig with The Doors, grew his hair out, and started rocking a different look. They were both acting jobs. Because what we find is that the sons and daughters of high-ranking military personnel are used whenever an agenda needs to be pushed. They're the tried and trusted ones that they go to first off, because they come from these tried and trusted families. It's difficult to know whether what we're seeing is genuine rebellion from these young people, or whether they've been put up to it. It may be a combination of the two. Another example that people cite is that of Bob Marley. So Bob Marley's father, Norvell Sinclair Marley, was a British naval commander. We can wonder whether Bob, becoming a socially conscious revolutionary sort of artist, was doing that to rebel against his father's values, or whether again he was put up to it. I certainly lean more towards Bob Marley being the genuine article than Jim Morrison. I personally suspect that Jim Morrison's death, as it was reported to us in 1971 at the age of 27, was faked. And from many of the things that I've seen, I suspect that this is the case with many artists who have had family ties to the intelligence communities. When we're told they've died, we shouldn't necessarily assume that that's the case.
There's been a lot of discussion over the intel community influence on popular music going back to the Beatles.
Sharon Tate's dad was Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tate. So he was Office of Naval Intelligence, and he was a military man to his core. So once again, we have a direct connection between one of these actors, literally, and the world of the military. Many people would argue that the Manson Tate murders were used in part to put a nail in the coffin of that whole hippie era and all the ideals that came with it. The 60s were considered to be pretty much over. So it was a very short-lived scene, but I would argue that the legacy of it is still being felt today, because it was all about changing societal attitudes towards music, culture, family, sex, drugs, and everything in between.
Of course, the most famous incident that happened in Laurel Canyon was the Charlie Manson murders of Roman Polanski's wife, Sharon Tate, and 3 others. Roman Polanski directed Jack Nicholson in Chinatown, and it was at Jack Nicholson's house that Roman Polanski raped a 13-year-old girl, in which he had to leave the country or he would go to jail for like 20 years. And it was right after that that Jack Nicholson left America and went to England to shoot The Shining for over a year.
Why didn't you shout or something? Oh, no? I tried to go to the bathroom. Yeah. Oh, it's too cold.
In the beginning of the film, Ullman mentions to Jack that the people in Denver recommended Jack very highly.
Our people in Denver recommended Jack very highly, and for once, I agree with them.
Like, who are these people in Denver? Why are they directing a hotel that's out in the middle of nowhere sitting on top of a mountain that's closed half the year?
The people in Denver are mentioned several times in this interaction between Ullman and Jack.
Did they give you any idea in Denver about what the job entails? I don't suppose they told you anything in Denver about the tragedy we had up here during the winter of 1970?
I also understand why your people in Denver left it for you to tell me.
Many people have noticed that the hotel manager, Ullman, looks a lot like JFK. What people don't realize is that many of the people that worked with Kubrick also worked with Kennedy. When Spartacus, Kubrick's film Spartacus came out, there was a lot of controversy because the screenwriter was Dalton Trumbo, who was part of the blacklisted writers of people in Hollywood from the 1950s. Kubrick came under a lot of fire from far right-wing groups for working with him, for making Spartacus.
I'll take a little Republican corruption along with a little Republican freedom, but I won't take the dictatorship of Crassus.
John F. Kennedy went to go see Spartacus, and after the movie, he endorsed it. In one fell swoop, Spartacus has a gigantic hit, one of Kubrick's biggest hits of all time. He had to admit that he owed it to Kennedy.
Maybe there's no peace in this world. For us or for anyone else, I don't know. But I do know that as long as we live, we must stay true to ourselves.
Officially, on the record, the CIA's MKUltra program ran from 1953 to 1973. The Process Church of the Final Judgment was an organization based in San Francisco, headed up by a couple, Mary and Robert de Grimston, and it seems to be a kind of occult mystery school organization steeped in Satanism. It was inherently linked with the whole Summer of Love of 1967, being that that event was based very much around San Francisco. And there are many key characters who figure in the narrative of those times who have got ties to the Process Church. One of them is Charles Manson. You also have Sirhan Sirhan, who is the guy who is said to have assassinated Robert Kennedy, although lots of evidence suggests that he didn't actually do it. He was merely fitted up for it and made to believe that he'd done it through some MKUltra style mind control experimentation. So he was connected to the process. There is circumstantial evidence to suggest that many of the famous serial killers that we hear about were dosed with LSD as part of their MKUltra style mind control programming. So when we get to characters like Son of Sam David Berkowitz, for instance, I've heard it suggested that LSD could have been a factor there. And actually, Dave McGowan, the aforementioned author of Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, previously had a book called Program to Kill, where he looked at many of these high-profile serial killer cases, and his overall contention was that they also were products of the CIA's MKUltra program. So they weren't just these lone nuts that for some reason went a bit crazy and went out on these murderous rampages for no apparent reason. They were effectively commissioned, programmed to do so. These were all CIA-sponsored experiments.
Dave McGowan, who's the author of Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, which was an expose of all the stuff that went on in Laurel Canyon in the 1960s, was a good friend of mine. And we used to discuss the fact that the hotel that was there before the secret movie studio put in by the Air Force looked an awful lot like the hotel that was in The Shining, the Overlook. So Lookout Mountain Hotel looked a lot like the Overlook Hotel.
The old hotel burnt down, and the Air Force and probably some intelligence agencies built another building on the exact spot where the hotel used to be. And this building was known as Lookout Mountain Studios, ran by the Air Force.
Lookout Mountain Air Force Station, a photographic installation of the Aerospace Audiovisual Service, Military Airlift Command, and home of the 1352nd Photographic Group, containing facilities to accomplish all phases of photography. Staffed by both civilian and military filmmakers of the United States Air Force.
Prior to Laurel Canyon becoming a hotbed for the music industry in the 1960s, it was populated mainly by Hollywood film personnel. So actors, directors, producers. Reportedly, there were more films made at Lookout Mountain than at all the other film studios in Hollywood. In the midst of this neighborhood, Laurel Canyon, you had this military base known as Lookout Mountain. And this was where a number of propaganda films were made on behalf of the American military and the American government.
Our camera crews ranged from the islands in the Pacific to the atomic test site in Nevada, documenting activities for film reports that told the story of nuclear weapons testing by the United States.
So a lot of people would be familiar with these so-called atomic test films, where you had a house in the middle of nowhere and a family sat at a table, and the film would show the devastation of a nuclear attack if the bomb should ever drop and the place gets obliterated. That's an example of the sort of films that were getting made at Lookout Mountain. And there were many household names who had top security clearance for that place, such as Walt Disney, Marilyn Monroe, James Stewart, Cary Grant, Ronald Reagan. Nobody really knows what they were doing up there.
Our stage has heard the voices of and played host to many celebrities from stage and screen, as well as high-ranking military and Department of Defense personnel.
But it was a place which had a lot of different installations. It had its own nuclear bunker, reportedly, a sort of fallout shelter. It had its own helicopter pad, several film stages, several recording studios, and a lot of stuff went on there. Nobody really knows exactly what, because it was top secret, but from the 1940s through to pretty much the end of the 60s or the very early 70s, this is the kind of activity that took place there. So it does seem suspicious that right in the middle of this neighbourhood, where you've got all these musicians who would go on to change culture, change societal attitudes in such radical ways, you had a military base. And we find this throughout in the history of Laurel Canyon. It's not just musicians. There are many film stars, famous Hollywood film stars, who have family connections back into the world of the military. So the music industry and the film industry are very much entwined in this way, and we find the same connections throughout.
Isn't it a coincidence that the Air Force had a studio called Lookout Mountain, and the hotel In Stanley Kubrick's The Shining is called the Overlook, Lookout, Overlook. And that Lookout Mountain was an Air Force studio where many films were made. Many are still classified to this very day. What was going on there? What else was the Air Force doing there?
The history of MKUltra really puts a light on any Air Force involvement with it, even to this day. Back in the 50s, when the CIA brought in the military branches to introduce them to the MKUltra technology methods of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, the Air Force was known to be the most excited, the most turned on by MKUltra and its prospects. They were the only branch that started their own independent MKUltra program. What I find interesting is that in 73, 74, when the CIA had to come clean about what they've been doing with this MKUltra stuff, not a word out of the Air Force. The Air Force to this day has never had to go before Congress and say exactly what they've done with MKUltra, the extent of it. Now, when I was an agent, I became an agent 30 years ago. During my time on active duty, I was told about what was done to my father with hypnosis. He had been active duty Air Force in the late 50s, and what I was told by someone who's a superior officer to me was that the Air Force used hypnosis on my dad to suppress his memories of this ultra classified operation he was involved with out in East Arizona in the summer of 1958. And in the subsequent research and investigation I've done on my dad's situation, it suggests to me that the Air Force MKUltra program, in my opinion, had to have gone farther than the CIA took it back between the early 50s and up to 74, when they had to admit what they had been doing. Look at some UFO cases, and the things that are reported tells me that MKUltra is likely being applied. The answer, in my opinion, is yes. The Air Force is definitely, to some extent, using MKUltra.
The Air Force Missile Mission, starring Jimmy Stewart, produced and photographed here at Lookout Mountain to explain weapons and policy, to show how both planes and missiles are needed for our defense.
Kubrick lived on and off in Los Angeles from the early 1940s until the mid-1960s, so it's very likely that he knew about the secret Air Force movie studio up on Laurel Canyon. That would explain the weird coincidence of how the Lookout Mountain Hotel looks a lot like the Overlook Hotel in The Shining. When Stanley was in the middle of making Dr. Strangelove, he asked the Pentagon if they would let him see the inside of a B-52 so that he would get it accurate. The Pentagon read the script for Dr. Strangelove and was so horrified by it that they said, no, you can't use it. So Kubrick and his art designer carefully went through a whole bunch of aviation weekly magazines, cutting out all photographs of the inside of a B-52, and they built their set. When the Air Force saw the inside of the set of the B-52 in the movie, they thought that Stanley had gotten some kind of secret information because he had built it so accurately to the T of what an inside of a B-52 looked like. This alarmed the Air Force so much that they actually came and visited Stanley in 1963. This probably was the opening door to Stanley's entrance into the intelligence community.
While we were shooting, somebody had invited some American service personnel to come to Shepperton. They were terrified by the amount of accuracy we had in this aircraft. And the next day I got a memo from Stanley saying, you better make sure that you know where all your references came from, because otherwise we might be investigated by the FBI.
It's only emerging now that we understand that Kubrick had actual deep ties to the intelligence world.
This is a June 4th, 1965 document from the U.S. Information Agency. It is addressed to the President of the United States. The memo recommends hiring 4 known directors of films. They are being recommended for some unknown project, with Stanley Kubrick being recommended as most promising.
We really don't know what these famous film directors were being recruited for, what project or whatever. Was it the moon landing? I mean, it happened in 1964, so that would be just about the right time that they would be looking for someone. This is actually the smoking gun proving that Kubrick was working with the government. Kubrick's first 2 films, Fear and Desire and Killer's Kiss, were produced by Richard de Rochemont. The Rochemont family is a very famous French family known for their French intelligence, British intelligence, the CIA, and Operation Mockingbird.
And then there is the curious case of the CIA Kubrick counterintelligence program, which uses isolation and sensory deprivation techniques. Is this just a coincidence? Kubrick?
The Hollywood film industry was based just a stone's throw from all this stuff that was happening in Laurel Canyon. So the 2 industries, I would suggest, were controlled in many cases by the same forces, and there are common factors which link the 2, not least MK Ultra, mind control, coming out of the CIA, and we're told that in the 70s it was all wrapped up and it was disclosed and they ceased doing the experimentation. Yeah, right. Who really buys that? If anything, it just went off the books, underground, and became a black ops project. Among the elements that were used were the application of electroshock treatment, the use of sensory deprivation tanks. So they would put subjects in total darkness and totally cut off from all sensory stimulation to study what effect that would have on the mind. They would also use mind-altering drugs. They wanted to see what would happen to the human mind if it were subjected to horrific levels of trauma. So it's referred to as trauma-based mind control. There are different derivatives of MK Ultra, including monarch programming.
So 2001 was also a way for them to figure out how to fake the moon landing, but it was also a giant advertisement for the aerospace industry and the military-industrial complex, which is probably who funded the movie. During the original run of 2001, there was a whole bunch of extra credits at the end of the movie that got removed after the first run. I have a list of those credits, and in those credits, the makers of 2001: A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick, thanked Langley, Virginia, Air Force Intelligence, Naval Intelligence, all of the giant aerospace companies in America. So it's clear that there was this link between the military-industrial complex and 2001: A Space Odyssey. In movies, you sit down and you write the script, and then you put the script into the production company. They go to the distribution company, they read the script, and then they give money to the production company. And Kubrick must have given Warner Brothers a script for The Shining, but for some reason, all during the shoot, and you can see this very clearly in Vivian Kubrick's film, The Making of The Shining, Kubrick is rewriting the movie. It got so frustrating for Jack Nicholson that he just stopped looking at the script.
Simply by picking them up and reading.
It turns me into a freaking monster.
I quit using my script. I just take the ones they type up each day.
What was Kubrick doing here? Was he trying to encode a secret meaning into The Shining that he didn't want anyone to know about? So therefore, he showed a bogus script to Warner Brothers with plans all along to rewrite it.
Kubrick has several references to Freemasonry in his films. The very opening shot of Eyes Wide Shut has Nicole Kidman undressing right between two pillars. And the two pillars are famous because they're called Joachim and Boaz in Freemasonry. And every Freemasonic hall has these two pillars in it.
The character played by Sidney Pollack in Eyes Wide Shut is named Ziegler. Ziegler is German for Mason.
I know what happened last night, and I know what's been going on since then. And I think you just might have the wrong idea about one or two things.
In Eyes Wide Shut, at the beginning, when Nicole Kidman is dancing with the strange Hungarian guy, there's 8 pointed stars on the walls all around them. The 8 pointed star is a Freemasonic symbol of Venus. Venus is, of course, Lucifer. Lucifer is the morning star in the book of Revelation. The morning star is Venus.
The poster for A Clockwork Orange is a pyramid that has Alex's cufflink as the all-seeing eye.
Yes, I think Kubrick was a man of genius, of real genius. I don't think everybody in the world likes all of his movies, like anybody else, but he made very few movies, and they were extraordinary. They are not like anyone else's movies. They're not exactly real.
A lot of these LSD and other experiments were funded jointly by the CIA, by the Public Health Service, and by the Masons, basically, through the Scottish Rite Foundation.
Sure, I'm Joe Atwell. I'm an independent researcher and author. I wrote Caesar's Messiah and Shakespeare's Secret Messiah. I also have a dozen or so articles at a website called Post Flaviana. These articles deal with the modern literature that I've done analysis regarding. One of the articles that has received, I would say, the most attention is an article I wrote on Catcher in the Rye. J.D. Salinger was a member of the OSS, and following World War II was part of what was referred to as counterintelligence, which is a very small organization, but it was responsible for basically debriefing Nazis and also enforcing propaganda. It was engaged in mind control. One of the individuals was Henry Kissinger, right? So Salinger was in this group. So this is a bad trajectory for an author that is going to have a lot of cultural influence in America, because the OSS then basically morphs into the CIA, which the very first thing it does, of course, is produce MK Ultra. Salinger's book has an occulted level to it, an occulted meaning, which basically is the description of Holden Caulfield's process by which he becomes a master Freemason. I knew almost immediately when I was reading it that it was related to Freemasonry, because it was at the very beginning of the book they talk about Holden Caulfield sleeps in Eli's bed. And I'm a Bible scholar. I write about the Bible. I knew what Eli's bed was, and I knew what Eli's bed was relative to Freemasonry, because this is actually a story about Solomon. Solomon being the builder of the temple, very important character for Freemason, and events in his life have been woven into their initiation system. And so then when I saw that, I went backwards to the beginning of the book and tried to understand the first episode, which is that he needs to study the Egyptians for 28 days. Specifically mentions the number of days. And I didn't know what that meant. I'm not a Freemason, and I don't know what these things are. I have to do research to find out. But I have a friend of mine who's a Mason, lives right next door. I just walked over there and I said, Dave, what is this studying for 28 days? Is this related to Freemasonry? And he laughed and he goes, oh yeah, that is the first initiation. You have to study the ancient rites of Freemason, which is basically all Egyptian, for 28 days. And so then because I had that, the two of them, and in sequence, I could see, well, that probably means the whole book is like this. Following that, Caulfield is blinded, he's covered, his head is covered, and then he receives a blow and he's knocked down. And this is, again, is just an obvious representation of one of the rites of Freemasonry where the initiate is blindfolded and knocked in the head and supposed to have a symbolic death. And Caulfield even says that he says, I feel like I'm dead. Because remember, the occulted meaning of like Catcher in the Rye, or even like the New Testament or the Shakespearean literature, the occulted meaning has to be comprehensible, right? It's just hidden usually in a very systematic way so that it could be understood by someone coming along later on who knows what the real meaning is supposed to be. Holden goes through the initiations and he's ready to become a very high-level Freemason. He's escorted by two brothers, representing the Brothers of Freemasonry, and they take him up to this area in a museum where the ancient Egyptians are. And the brothers say they're too afraid, they can't go in, so Caulfield must go in alone. Again, this is, known to be one of the aspects of the initiations of Freemasonry, that they would go into themselves to receive some sort of secret. So once you have that interpretive frame, once you go, what the writer is doing with Catcher in the Rye is he's making a kind of a satire, using Holden Caulfield on the Freemason initiation process. Once you have that little understanding, the whole book becomes, everything becomes visible. It's not hard. And Salinger sort of underlines this by stating that Caulfield has become a member of a secret fraternity that he was too chicken not to join. He actually mentions this so that the informed reader doesn't have any real doubt about this. You get the fez as you go through the process. At a certain point, after he's passed the first one, he gets a people shooting hat, which is a red hat that he puts on. But notice he calls it a people shooting hat. You see, this is the truth about Freemasonry. What the fez actually represents is that you are now aligned with our values, which is to say, you can kill anyone in defense of our interests. You have complete moral authority. And that's really what's chilling about Freemasonry. And understanding this fact is that he calls it a people shooting hat. And then at the end, when he has the apocalyptic moment with the children, again, it's just kind of complicated symbolism to get to understanding it, but he's killing the children, but he has his people shooting hat on. And that's really why the hat was introduced, and it's not just to introduce him as a Freemason, but to give him that moral authority that they claim, that they have the right to kill anyone and to promote their interests. So if you look at those events as a package, you can see that the very obvious representation of the beginning process of becoming a Freemason. At the conclusion of the book, there's an instruction being given that if someone violates the principle of secrecy, then they are to be disappeared. And I certainly know that John Lennon, before the assassination, in the Playboy interview, he was giving away too many, kind of secret bits about Freemasonry. And he was also saying, I don't want to be a craftsman anymore. I respect them, but I don't want to be a craftsman. And I can assure you he was aware that craftsman was a synonym for Freemason. He also made the claim in the article, in the interview, that the CIA had been responsible for LSD, which is true, and I think it's something that would not be something the Freemasons would want known. And this is why the book has been associated with assassinations. It isn't because the book is a trigger, which has been suggested, that somehow the book is like a Manchurian Candidate trigger that creates the behavior of assassinations. What the book is there for is to give this message to Freemasons that you must maintain secrecy concerning our project. And if you don't, the punishment is death. John Lennon was assassinated because he spoke out. And this is the imprimatur of that act. He spoke out and he got the results just as Holden Caulfield described at the end of Catcher in the Rye.
There's the suspicion that the book Catcher in the Rye is used as a trigger mechanism for MK assassins. We have Chapman and Hinckley, who had Catcher in the Rye on their person and were reading it obsessively. You even have, look at J.D. Salinger, himself with a military background, a military intelligence background. There's some interesting info when you look at J.D. Salinger more closely that I think strongly suggests that that book is definitely the trigger that many researchers and theorists have proposed it to be.
Well, that just happens to be exactly what I'm looking for. I'm outlining a new writing project, and 5 months of peace is just what I want.
Jack's character within The Shining is a writer, so it's highly likely that it is his copy of Catcher in the Rye that Wendy is reading. From almost the start of the film, we get our first clue as to what The Shining is really about. You can look at The Shining and see that Jack is being programmed to kill. The forces at work within the hotel are trying to get Jack to kill his family.
There's nothing I look forward to with greater pleasure. I give you my word.
So Catcher in the Rye seems to have been a trigger for that aspect of MK Ultra. But there are many different aspects as well, including Monarch programming. And we see examples of this in things like the infamous Britney Spears interview from many years ago now, where she's being interviewed by Diane Sawyer. And right in the middle of the interview, Diane Sawyer seems to say something to her which causes her to dissociate from reality and go into one of these alters that's been programmed within her. She just literally seems to become a different person. And she starts behaving very strangely, starts crying, acts as if she's speaking to another person that's just come in the room. And then she pulls herself together and she says, "Strong, Brittany," and comes back into herself.
This spasm of publicity about what happened from Mexico to London
was pretty rough. Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of weird. Ah, weird. Hello. Oh my goodness. Hello. Ew. Strong, Brittany. Yeah, it was a weird. Ew. I'm embarrassed. Can we stop it?
And I think Diane Sawyer knowingly uttered a phrase there which caused her to go into that state. And it's at that point that Brittany seems to dissociate.
Near the beginning of the movie of The Shining, Halloran even tells Danny that there's something about the place that isn't real. He tells him that when you see things here in the hotel, just think of them as pictures in a book.
Remember what Mr. Halloran said? It's just like pictures in a book, Danny. It isn't real.
Is this Stanley Kubrick letting the audience know that this is some kind of experiment that's being run at the Overlook Hotel?
The supply lines always lead back to the CIA, and in many cases they're the glue that holds the music industry and the film industry together. They were taking test subjects who in many cases consisted of prison inmates. It would be people from mental institutions who would be getting experimented on against their will with no consent, which is why the public was told in the 1970s that MKUltra had been decommissioned, because the CIA admitted that they shouldn't have been doing it, but much evidence shows that they're still doing it to this day. Not only that, but they like rubbing our noses in it and putting little symbolic, cryptic clues and Easter eggs pertaining to the fact that they're still doing it in movies, TV shows, music videos, and things of that nature.
The family is isolated up at the hotel during the winter, which is a perfect place to run some sort of psychological CIA experiment on Jack, Wendy, and Danny. The first time that Danny encounters anything strange is in the games room when he sees the twins. Now, if you zoom in to the left-hand side, there's a poster on the wall, and at the bottom of this poster says the word Monarch. Many have said that this is referring to Monarch Ski Resort in Colorado, but it is not. This is Monarch CIA MK Ultra.
My name is Kathy O'Brien. I am a survivor of CIA MK Ultra Project Monarch Mind Control. Monarch is a multi-generational sub-project of MK Ultra. I'm very fortunate to have survived it. I've been speaking out for over 35 years on MK Ultra Project Monarch and healing from it.
The buildings behind me were the headquarters for the World War II Office of Strategic Services. It was here that the first halting steps toward mind control began.
I was born into Project Monarch, which is a multi-generational, incest-based study of mind control. It had been found through the Hitler-Himmler research that was imported into the U.S. through Project Paperclip. When we brought the Nazi and fascist scientists into the U.S., they brought the formula for mind control with them. Trauma is the basis of it, whether it's of an individual, a nation, or the world. The way our brains respond to trauma is how mind control works, and they found there's no trauma more horrific on the human mind than sexual abuse of a child prior to age 5 while the brain is still forming. The way our brains respond to trauma is like our conscious mind freezes in fright and leaves our subconscious mind wide open to being easily led and manipulated. The neuron pathways in the brain actually shut down around trauma and repress it deep into the subconscious so the rest of the mind can develop and function normally. Well, after repeated traumas like I experienced from birth, not only was my father's sexual abuse extreme, I was an infant, I didn't judge it, I didn't know that what he was doing was wrong, but my brain knew it was wrong, and it shut down the neuron pathways around that trauma, repressed it, so the rest of my mind could develop and function. But my father was also using me in child pornography, so that shut down more neuron pathways. And then he was using me to being trafficked to my grandfather's Blue Masonic Lodge, to the local politicians and law enforcement there. My mind control experience as a child, I really thought it was the way the whole world was. And as I lost more and more free thought, like when my father sold me into the project in the early 60s, I just really felt like the whole world was saturated in it. My family was, my church was, the local politicians, where everybody seemed to be involved in it. So I didn't have any ability to think, to know anything about MK Ultra or the Project Monarch that I was thrust into. Nevertheless, the people around me talked about it all the time. So by the time that intelligence insider Mark Phillips lifted my daughter and me out of the Washington, D.C. swamp, the human trafficking swamp, in 1988, and handed me keys to my own mind. In other words, helped me remember that it was within me to heal myself. And it's within us all to heal. And when we heal from within, we diffuse all triggers. We have an ability to remember everything that I had experienced, everything that I had been tortured to forget. And in remembering that, I could remember in photographic detail what others were saying about Project Monarch around me, the multi-generational aspect, knowing how the local politician who had approached my father and told him he could receive immunity from prosecution for making child pornography of me if he would agree to sell me into MK Ultra Mind Control. That was a conversation that I had overheard. And of course, that local politician was Gerald Ford. And as his political career escalated, so too did my victimization in MK Ultra mind control till I was around a whole lot of the political perpetrators at the top of the MK Ultra mind control project. And they talked openly about Monarch. And they even talked about it for the education system, how they wanted to manipulate generations of knowledge within the school system. So the indoctrination has been in place heavily since the mid-'80s that I know of for the deliberate purposes of creating a multi-generational compliance.
It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The result you can see.
It is highly likely that Kubrick was familiar with the CIA's MK Ultra program, which probably inspired him to write and direct A Clockwork Orange in 1970. And Stanley Kubrick is placing clues within the movie The Shining to let the audience know that the film is really about mind control and how to control a person to make him kill his own family.
Wendy, I'm home.
These clues include a hidden swastika in the background of the gold room, possibly symbolizing the Nazi infiltration into the United States through Project Paperclip, and also possibly symbolizing the MK Ultra experiments being ran in Nazi Germany, headed up by Joseph Mengele.
We know that NASA was deeply interested in Kubrick's production of 2001. Several top-ranking NASA officials even visited the set several times. In fact, the studio where 2001 was being shot was called NASA East.
My MK Ultra mind control experience, I was taken to various military, NASA, and DARPA installations for sophisticated mind control programming. That anything I was told, or however my perceptions were manipulated at the time, is exactly what I believed. I was not able to think beyond that, neither think further forward, nor think back and access other information, so I was only in the moment. Our ability for critical analysis and being able to use our conscious mind. So by the time conscious thought is pretty much lost to the repetitive systematic trauma, then other aspects of our brain do kick in. We get more heightened senses, we get intuitions and telepathic capability. It's not that we develop them, it's just that we access that part of our brain that otherwise is pretty much dormant. We develop heightened senses from the extreme trauma. And again, this was known in the Hitler-Himmler research. So the strategic repetitive trauma is something that is imposed very deliberately to keep our conscious mind frozen in fright, so we're more compliant and easily led. This kind of systematic mind control is being used on society as a whole to create a more compliant society that will go along with the New World Order. Ultimately, it is a slave society agenda, and they need us all compliant, so they're really pushing. The formula for mind control is the same, whether it's of an individual, a nation, or the world. Trauma, like I said, is the basis of it.
Your son has a very great talent. I don't think you are aware how great it is.
When Jack meets the previous caretaker of the Overlook, Grady, he tells Jack that Danny is becoming a problem, that Danny has contacted outside forces who are coming this way, and that Jack must eliminate Danny in the same way that Grady eliminated his two daughters.
But I corrected them, sir.
Wendy, in the beginning of the film, admits to the doctor that Jack has previously abused Danny.
On this particular occasion, my husband just used too much strength and he injured Danny's arm.
Jack later admits this to Lloyd, the bartender.
I've been hurt once, okay? It was an accident. Completely unintentional.
It is very likely that Danny's psychic abilities came from the abuse by Jack.
Trauma is always the key to MKUltra style mind control programming. And with many of the experiments that took place in these labs, the experiences would have been so horrific for the subjects that it causes their minds to shatter into different compartments as the only way the mind has of dealing with what is happening to it. So it dissociates from reality, it tucks the traumatic experience away within recesses of the mind that it creates for itself so that it doesn't have to face up to what's happening to it there and then. It seems to unlock abilities within the mind which aren't ordinarily there. Because the trauma has caused the mind to open up and go to different places that it never normally would, it can take on all these amazing abilities. That's where things like remote viewing come in, and telekinesis, and these different psychic abilities that the MKUltra doctors were always trying to develop in the subjects. Trauma is the key, and it can lead to some incredible abilities. It's just unfortunate that people have to go through such horrors in order to unlock these abilities.
At first, the isolation up at the Overlook Hotel and past trauma is starting to cause Jack some problems. He then lashes out at Wendy.
I finally have a chance to accomplish something when I'm really into my work. Shoveling out driveways, working a car wash. Does that appeal to you?
After Jack takes the drink given to him by Lloyd the bartender, he begins having his hallucinations.
Hi, Lloyd. A little slow tonight, isn't it?
Like, exactly who is Lloyd? How does Jack know him? And where did the booze come from? Because Ullman told Jack at the beginning of the movie that all the booze had been removed from the hotel.
We always remove all the booze from the premises when we shut down. That reduces the insurance we normally have to carry.
Which is interesting because the first time Jack meets Lloyd in the Gold Room, he says that he doesn't have any money.
Say, Lloyd, it seems I'm temporarily late.
The second time Jack is in the Gold Room, he magically has money.
No charge to Mr. Torrance.
The CIA has been known to spike alcoholic drinks with LSD and even spray LSD aerosol on entire groups of unsuspecting people.
Experimental drugs, including LSD, were administered to human guinea pigs. The patients were never told that their treatment was part of a CIA experiment.
The nominal head of the MKUltra project was a guy named Sidney Gottlieb. So he's the guy that was put out up front as the public face of it. And there is this story which involves him spiking the drink of one of his deputies, this guy Frank Olson. And Olson is said to have gone a bit crazy, started behaving erratically, and he jumped out of a window to his death. This is a story you get often with people who've been on LSD.
He ended his life at this New York hotel by diving through a shaded closed window in his 10th floor room. Frank Olson was the first known fatality in the CIA's LSD program.
Jack doesn't experience anything that could be considered demonic at the hotel until he is provided that alcoholic drink by Lloyd, the bartender.
Words of wisdom, Lloyd. Words of wisdom.
And then the next thing, he's in room 237, hallucinating the lady that's in there. When you go into room 237, all the colors are really psychedelic and vivid, from the carpeting to the curtains, as if the heightened colors are some kind of hallucination. Did Jack get dosed with LSD from Lloyd's drink, as the CIA was famous for doing in the 1960s?
Right after Jack takes his first drink of alcohol provided to him by Lloyd the bartender,
Here's to 5 miserable months on the wagon.
Wendy comes into the gold room and asks Jack to go into room 237.
He went up into one of the bedrooms. The door was open and he saw this crazy woman in the bathtub. She tried to strangle him.
He goes into room 237 and encounters the old woman, and then later on says that nothing happened in room 237.
So is it possible that there's an aerosol in the room spewing out LSD gas? And did Danny have the same thing when he went into the room earlier?
Because we know what happened in the apartment that they had, where a CIA operative had the aerosol LSD, would invite these random people for a party, and they would spray the LSD in the air. So that's just the instance we know about. And I think we know that if we know about one instance, there's at least 10 that we don't know about.
In MK Ultra, various formulas were used, various drugs were imposed, but they were pretty much like CIA designer drugs and not the kind of drugs we would think like the misnomer on MK Ultra of LSD, because it had been found that LSD actually opened neuron pathways in the brain while they're wanting to shut them down. Other components are sleep, food, and water deprivation, and repetitive subconscious manipulation, because repetition is the most basic form of mind control. It's why the controlled media's repetitive narrative is the same all around the world. They use the same phraseology to manipulate the minds of the population.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarmingly, some media outlets publish these things simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 The point of this MK Ultra experiment going on at the Overlook Hotel is that they're trying to see if they can mind control Jack into killing his family.
Then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house in.
This is very likely why Stanley Kubrick wrote the scene where Jack is not actually writing a book, and Wendy comes in and discovers that Jack is just writing the same sentence over and over again. This is psychic driving. This is a MK Ultra technique.
In the past, pain was the obvious torture method. You just put them on the rack, pull those fingernails off. And I'm not saying that wasn't done, but what they did with this psychiatric method was to use the isolation, to get into their heads, to break them psychologically, psycho-emotionally. And then once they broke them down, they could get information from them more easily. Then the concern was, okay, once they break them down, what are they putting in there?
The next step was what he called psychic driving. This involved almost endless tape-recorded messages and more drugs for the patient. Cameron wrote that this was the way to make direct control changes in personality.
And then he would attempt to implant new ideas in the mind of the patient.
So Jack supposedly is writing this book all day, and Wendy can't even come in to see what he's doing. She finally does sneak into his office. She gets a copy of the book, and of course it's the famous scene, probably the most famous scene in the movie, where she discovers that Jack is just writing the same sentence over and over.
By using this technique, psychic driving, making Jack repeat the same phrase over and over again, this CIA MK Ultra technique is turning Jack into a murderer.
There are the cases that have been discussed that I think there's something to the connection. Sirhan comes to mind. I have to be careful here, but I started working for the FBI in 1988. I was an evidence technician. And so I worked in the evidence vault in Los Angeles at the LA field office. And this was 20 years after the Bobby Kennedy assassination. 20 years. All solved, right? Sirhan's been in prison 20 years. We know who did it, no questions. It's all solved. The ballistic evidence for the Sirhan case was not kept in the evidence vault. And it's not at the National Archives. It's kept somewhere else where one agent can get to it. Now, I found that interesting, and particularly over the years, the more I learned about Sirhan, I found that incredibly interesting because close and shut case, right? And I have begun to question whether Sirhan did it. Like a lot of people do. So you have, additionally, with these other things I'm talking about, you have the notebook where Sirhan was, RFK must die, RFK must die, repeatedly. This is part of psychic driving, okay? When you're driving a narrative into that psyche, when you want the person to believe something. With this, they could put him in position and anything could have happened and he wouldn't know. He doesn't remember it. And I do think that he's an example of an MK Ultra subject.
Just like Sirhan wrote over and over, RFK must die, before the RFK assassination, Jack is writing his own view of psychic driving. And then Jack discovers that Wendy now knows he's triggered. And after that, he begins to do violence against his family.
I said, I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains. I'm gonna bash them right the fuck in.
MK Ultra mind control is so absolute. Anyone can be programmed to do anything. Absolutely, people can be programmed to kill. This kind of programming is so strong that MK Ultra mind control is used on and by the U.S. military, particularly in special forces operations. We can take this all the way down to the video games that children are given to play. Those video games originally were used to condition the military to be able to point and shoot without any critical analysis or compassion, to just go with it as though it were a game, in which case it's another distortion of that bypasses our natural hesitations.
It's even implied that Jack knows that this entire thing is some sort of MK Ultra experiment that's been ran up at the Overlook. When he states to Wendy, "Have you ever thought about my responsibility to my employers, that I have signed a contract?"
Have you ever thought for a single solitary moment about my responsibilities to my employers? And that I have signed a letter of agreement, a contract?
Who's he talking about?
Our people in Denver recommended Jack very highly.
The most truly and unexplainable event in the film The Shining is when Wendy drags Jack's body into the storage room, which is very interesting because it was previously set up by Halloran when he was giving Wendy and Danny a tour of the Overlook. And if you listen very closely to this section of the movie, it sounds like Halloran says the story room not the storage room.
Now, this is the storeroom. This is the storeroom. Now, this is the storeroom.
Which would make sense because at that point where Jack is in the story room is when it takes a very dark turn.
I and others have come to believe that your heart is not in this, that you haven't the belly for it.
The most unexplainable thing is when Jack is let out of the storage room by an unexplained force.
Go check it out.
Wendy wants to leave the Overlook, but Jack has done everything in his power to make it to where they can't leave. He has broken the radio. He has destroyed the snowcat, their only transportation off the mountain. The experiment must go on.
As Wendy's trauma increases because Jack is trying to kill her with an axe, she too begins to descend into the MK Ultra program and see the phantasms and hallucinations that the other two, Jack and Danny, have been seeing. But when she sees Halloran lying dead on the floor from an axe wound, the trauma just completely overwhelms her at that point.
She then sees a man with his head split, which is symbolizing the MK Ultra mind fracturing that victims go through.
Great party, isn't it?
So at this point, Danny is being chased by Jack in the maze. The maze is like a representation of the mind and how you trace your way through the mind.
As Jack goes further and further into delusions, basically becoming catatonic and reduced to a shell of a human being, which is what a lot of the MK Ultra victims go through. They end up catatonic due to the torturous abuse and sexual trauma that they have been through.
Additionally, there's an effort to create false memory in people to make them feel more helpless, like something is beyond our realm to affect. It makes someone feel like they don't have any control over this etherical entity outside themselves, when really it's the people who are imposing the trauma that need to be held accountable for the actions. Those false memories in that regard, or limited memories, can be created. One way to get beyond that is false memory does not have smell. It's like deprogram the program first and hear what was the setup, what it was being told, and realize that it was a lie all along.
Danny beats Jack by using the footprints to retrace his steps. He's doing exactly what MK Ultra victims do when they're trying to figure out what happened to them. They have to retrace their steps through the program to understand who did this to them and what happened to them.
False memory can be implanted on society, even when you think of, like, the Kennedy assassination was used to traumatize the nation, and we were all told the one bullet theory repetitively over and over again while we were still in a state of trauma. Well, people are looking beyond that now the same way they are looking beyond what we were told happened 9/11, because in essence those are false memories implanted on society as a whole that people are looking beyond now and thinking further.
Saddam Hussein has gone to elaborate lengths, spent enormous sums, taken great risks to build and keep weapons of mass destruction.
Nuclear weapon, nuclear weapon, nuclear weapon. We know he's got chemical weapons. He's got them, he's got them, he's got them.
What was real, what was manipulated, where perceptions were manipulated, to be able to sort through all that, and it helps take back discernment. I think all of society is at a point now where our ability to discern truth has been distorted and manipulated so much that we need to remember our own truth. So I think that we all need to consider how our knowledge base has been altered and realize we have a lot more to learn.
The same trauma-based programming that Kubrick is showing us in The Shining is also evident in what he himself does. In Vivian Kubrick's The Making of The Shining, we clearly see Stanley berating and traumatizing Shelley Duvall over and over again.
There's no desperation. Oh, come on. What do you mean roll video? We're fucking killing ourselves out here, and you've got to be ready.
I am too. I'm standing
Should we
right
play
by
mood
the
music?
door. No, I can't.
Yeah, but when you came out like this, you should have just...
You were sitting there because I say, wait a minute,
okay.
and then you say on the radio,
But when you
go.
do it, you've got to look desperate, Shelley. You're just wasting everybody's time.
You know, one would say, well, he's trying to get a good performance out of her, making her look scared and everything, but one has to really wonder, especially with things that happened to Shelley Duvall after The Shining.
You know, he'd turn on you in a moment and say, all right, you know, you're the big fella, let's see it. You know, I mean, that's about as harsh as he ever got with me. You know, I mean, he was a completely different director with Shelley.
Because it builds up anger, actually, and you get more out of yourself. And he knew that, and he knew he was getting more out of me by doing that. So it was sort of like a game. So I resented Stanley at times because he pushed me, and it hurt. And I resented him for it. I thought, why do you want to do this to me? How can you do this to me?
The whole thing is starting to feel like a setup and an experiment to see if they can get Jack to kill his family. Pretty much exactly like what Grady explained to Jack in the bathroom as to what he did to take care of his wife and daughters, which would really explain the entire ending of the film. It's not that Jack has been there before or that he's been there since 1921. It's not about reincarnation. It's a timeline of the experiments that's been running up at the Overlook since 1921. Some are successful, some aren't, depending on what the experiment is trying to achieve.
And if you think about it, the experiment ended badly. They failed to mind control Wendy. She won the game, even if she doesn't know it. Most people don't know that Stanley Kubrick shot an ending to The Shining that almost no one ever saw.
And after Stanley Kubrick noticed the audience reaction to the test screening of his movie, with everyone just getting up and walking out immediately after the movie ended, he sent his editor to the theaters to splice the reel to edit out the original ending. Or this could be an excuse that Kubrick used because this ending reveals the entire plot of the movie.
And that's how we end up with the famous ending to The Shining. But the alternate ending that Kubrick cut out, all we have is some photos and the script. And so looking at the script, we see that Ullman, the hotel manager, comes to visit Wendy in the hospital after the events that occurred in the movie. He tells her that they went to the Overlook and they couldn't find any evidence of what she was saying. And then Ullman tells her that it's understandable that she got things wrong because of all the trauma that she went through. But what this ending actually proves is that this movie is not about supernatural things. It's about a psychological operation that actually got cleaned up after it was over.
Ullman then hands Danny the tennis ball that Jack was bouncing off the walls previously in the film, and is also the tennis ball that miraculously rolled toward Danny. Unfortunately, very few people have seen this original ending to the film. They would have only seen it if they were a part of those test screenings, and it's probably the most infamous piece of lost media ever.
Stanley very famously destroyed all of the film that he shot that he didn't use, all of the outtakes and everything, which is a very odd thing to do for a guy that likes to preserve his history like he did. But what's also curious is there's another famous project where all the footage was destroyed after it was done, and that is the Apollo program. It was discovered in the late 1970s that all of the footage that they shot in the Apollo program had been destroyed. It's clear from Ullman's statements to Wendy in the ending that was cut out of the movie that there was some kind of cleanup operation, that they cleaned up the Overlook Hotel probably to get ready for the next experiment. But he also offers Wendy and Danny his home on the beach in LA for them to stay. And the question becomes, why would Ullman offer these two people his own personal home to stay in? And the reason is because as part of the experiment, he has to keep tabs on Wendy and Danny to see what effect the experiment had on them.
At the end of this alternate ending, there's a subtitle that pops up on the screen and says that the Overlook Hotel would survive this tragedy, as it had so many others. There are many clues that point to the fact that this theory of what The Shining is really about is the correct theory.
We have shown that many of the scenes in The Shining appear to be about mind control of the main characters by some outside forces.
There are many triggers scattered throughout the film. One is that Wendy is reading a book by an intelligence officer, J.D. Salinger, called Catcher in the Rye, which was found on the scene of 2 major assassinations, which both happened within 1 year of the release of The Shining.
Then there's the coincidence that the Lookout Mountain Hotel, which is replaced after it burned down by the Air Force's secret movie studio in Laurel Canyon, looks a lot like the Overlook Hotel in The Shining.
To the MK Ultra Monarch poster found on the wall, to the Nazi swastika in the background of the Gold Room. And we have seen how Danny may have received his psychic abilities from MK Ultra trauma-based mind control. We know that Stanley Kubrick was very interested in mind control and had to have known about the CIA's MK Ultra programs based off the fact that he made A Clockwork Orange in 1970.
Again, we have to remind you that Kubrick was being sought by the US government for some unknown program in the early 1960s, proving that there's a connection between the US government and Stanley Kubrick.
So it makes sense that he would take a novel with a very simple plot and overlay subtext within the film to disclose the fact that it is some sort of CIA MK Ultra program, and also exposing his intelligence ties. The mission being to isolate Jack and mind control him to murder his family. Just like what Ullman was saying in the beginning of the film, by saying that this is more of a psychologically demanding job than a physically demanding job.
A lot of people don't realize, but Stanley had a kind of disdain for the paranormal. He really didn't believe in paranormal stuff. And he was just more of a psychology guy. Big fan of Carl Jung, for instance, which he brings into his movie several times. And so it was easy for Stanley to rearrange the Stephen King novel and make the paranormal stuff actually part of an MK Ultra program.
Through the theatrics, the people running the operation at the Overlook Hotel are attempting to get Jack to murder his family. They are creating a mind-controlled killer that will do what they want and not even know that he did it.
I never like to say anything about my films because I think that the pleasure that an audience receives in discovering things for themselves is a great deal of what one likes about good films. I know myself, I don't like to read what something is about or to be told before I see it, or what it means. I think the best thing is when an audience looks at a film and wonders whether something that they see is an accident or whether the director or writer meant them to know it. I think that subtlety and allowing the audience to discover for themselves what it is the most important thing. That's why I've always tried to avoid interviews and explanations about the films. I think the film, should be able to speak for itself.